Little black girl told the judge. "I'm my mom's lawyer." Then something unbelievable happened. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. What happens when a man with a heart of stone tries to crush the spirit of a single mother? What happens when he thinks his money and his high-priced lawyer make him invincible? You're about to find out. Because what unfolded in a quiet, unassuming courtroom one Tuesday morning didn't just change one family's life. It sent a shockwave through the entire legal community. This is the story of how a 9-year-old girl, armed with nothing but her father's memory and an unshakable belief in justice, faced down a tyrant and reminded everyone that the truth has a power that no amount of money can buy. It started, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. For Lena Hayes, that paper was an eviction notice, cold and clinical, taped to the door of the small apartment she shared with her daughter Zola. It was their home, a sanctuary filled with the scent of Lena's baking and the quiet hum of Zola's reading lamp. And wasn't much, but it was theirs, a world they had carefully rebuilt after the devastating loss of Lena's husband, David, 2 years prior. The notice was from their landlord, Mr. Abernathy, a man who seemed to take pleasure in his own reflection, in the polished gleam of his expensive shoes. He was a man of clauses and sub-clauses, of policies and procedures, all of which seemed to be written in his favor. The notice claimed Lena had violated a community aesthetic clause, citing the colorful wind chimes Zola had hung on their tiny balcony, a gift from her late father. Lena knew it was a lie. There was no such clause in the lease she had signed. When she confronted him, Abernathy had simply smirked, producing a version of the lease, with the absurd rule nestled between two other legitimate ones, her signature stark at the bottom of the page. "It's right there, Miss Hayes," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. Policy is policy. Desperation was a cold, heavy blanket. Lena couldn't afford a lawyer. The legal aid office was swamped, their waiting list months long, so she found herself walking into the county courthouse, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her daughter's small, warm hand tucked firmly in hers. The air inside was sterile, smelling of old paper and faint anxiety. It was a place designed to intimidate, with its high ceilings that swallowed sound and its unforgiving wooden benches. People spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their faces etched with worry. Zola, however, was an island of calm in the churning sea of her mother's fear. She was a quiet child, with large, observant eyes that seemed to see more than most adults. Clutched in her other hand was a heavy, leather-bound book, its corners worn smooth with time. It was her father's journal, his most prized possession, and now it was hers. While Lena fidgeted, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve, Zola sat perfectly still, her gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every detail. The nervous shuffle of a man in a cheap suit, the bored expression on a bailiff's face, the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air. She wasn't just looking, she was studying. This was the world her father had inhabited, the world of arguments and evidence, of justice and injustice. He had been a public defender, a champion for the underdog, and he had talked to Zola about his work, not as a job, but as a calling. He taught her about precedent, about the burden of proof, about the sacred principle that everyone deserves a fair hearing. Lena, lost in her own panic, barely noticed her daughter's intense focus. All she could see was Abernathy, striding in with his lawyer, a man whose suit probably cost more than her car. They didn't even glance in her direction. To them she was a footnote, a minor administrative task to be completed before lunch. The tension in the waiting area was thick, a palpable thing you could almost taste. It was the collective weight of 100 different fears, 100 different hopes for a fair outcome. Lena felt herself shrinking under that weight, her confidence evaporating. How could she possibly win? How could her trembling voice stand up to their polished, expensive arguments? "All rise," a voice boomed, and the heavy doors to courtroom 4B swung open. The Honorable Judge Albright presiding. Lena's breath hitched. She squeezed Zola's hand, a silent plea for strength she didn't feel. As they stepped across the threshold, From the chaos of the hallway into the rigid order of the court, Lena felt a sense of finality. She was a lamb walking into a lion's den, but she didn't realize that the quiet child by her side was not a lamb at all. Zola was a guardian, and she was about to do something truly unbelievable. The courtroom was even more imposing than the hallway. Dark wood paneling rose to a high ceiling, and the American flag stood sentinel beside a bench that looked more like a throne. Judge Albright was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same stern oak as the bench he occupied. His face was a mask of judicial impartiality, his eyes scanning the room with an air of detached authority. He looked at the docket, his expression unchanging. Case 74, Abernathy Properties versus Lena Hayes, he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. Are both parties present? Mr. Abernathy's lawyer, a man named Mr. Finch, rose smoothly. We are, Your Honor. Thomas Finch for the plaintiff. He gestured to Abernathy, who gave a slight respectful nod that was utterly at odds with the smugness in his eyes. Judge Albright's gaze shifted to Lena. And the defendant? Lena stood on shaky legs, her voice barely a whisper. Lena Hayes, Your Honor. I'm representing myself. A flicker of something impatience perhaps crossed the judge's face. He disliked pro se defendants. They were messy, emotional, and unfamiliar with the precise, dispassionate language of the law. They slowed things down. Abernathy and Finch exchanged a nearly imperceptible smirk. This was going to be even easier than they thought. The proceedings began, and it was exactly the slaughter Lena had feared. Mr. Finch was a maestro of legal maneuvering. He presented the lease agreement, the one with the fraudulent clause, as Exhibit A. He spoke of Mr. Abernathy's long-standing reputation as a community-minded property owner, of his reluctant but necessary decision to enforce the rules for the good of all tenants. His words were smooth, logical, and devastating. Ms. Hayes, Judge Albright said, turning to her. Your response? Lena clutched her worn copy of the original lease, the one without the wind chime clause. Your Honor, that's not the lease I signed. I have my copy right here. The rule he's talking about, it isn't in it. Finch was on his feet before she could finish. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making unsubstantiated claims. The document entered into evidence, Exhibit A, is the legally binding contract, signed by both parties. Her copy is irrelevant, unless she can prove it supersedes the official record. Sustained, the judge grunted. Ms. Hayes, do you have evidence that your document is the correct one, and that Exhibit A has been tampered with? Lena stammered. I just know it is. He added that rule after I moved in. He's trying to get me out, because he wants to raise the rent for the next tenant. Objection. Finch's voice was sharp. Speculation. The defendant is imputing my client's character without a shred of proof. Sustained, Judge Albright repeated, his voice colder this time. Ms. Hayes, stick to the facts. Do you have any proof? A witness? A dated correspondence about this specific clause? No. But, Lena's voice trailed off. It was her word against his, and his word was wrapped in a $3,000 suit, and backed by a man who knew how to twist the rules, until they screamed. The room felt like it was closing in on her. The legal jargon was a wall she couldn't climb. Every time she tried to explain the simple truth, the word objection cut her off. Abernathy sat there, a portrait of false sympathy, occasionally shaking his head, as if pained by her stubborn refusal to see reason. He was enjoying the narrator's voice in Zola's head. Her father's voice was calm and clear. They are using procedure to hide the truth. Procedure is the shield of justice, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a cage. Throughout it all, Zola sat motionless, her eyes fixed on Mr. Abernathy. She wasn't watching him with anger, but with a chillingly analytical focus. She watched the tiny muscle that twitched in his jaw when Lena mentioned raising the rent. She saw the way his fingers drummed a silent, arrogant rhythm on the table. She saw the flash of triumph in his eyes every time Judge Albright said sustained. He was a liar. Her father had taught her how to spot them. It wasn't just about what they said. It was about the entire story they told with their bodies, their pauses, their over-rehearsed confidence. And Mr. Abernathy's story was a poorly written fiction. Judge Albright sighed, a sound of weary finality. Ms. Hayes, you have presented no evidence to counter the plaintiff's claim. You have offered only hearsay and speculation based on the evidence before me, specifically the signed lease agreement. I am inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiff. Lena's shoulders slumped. Tears welled in her eyes. Hot and stinging. It was over. They would be homeless. All because of a lie she couldn't find the right words to expose. The gavel was in the judge's hand. He was lifting it to bring it down to seal their fate. The sound of it would be the end, but it never landed. In the suffocating silence of the courtroom, a new sound emerged. It was small but clear as a bell. It was the sound of a 9-year-old girl, standing up on the wooden bench to make herself seen. Zola Hayes, her back ramrod straight, her father's heavy journal held against her chest like a shield, looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice not trembling, not pleading, but firm and measured. "I would like to speak." Every head in the courtroom swiveled towards her. The bailiff, startled out of his boredom, took a step forward. "Sit down, little girl." Mr. Abernathy let out a short, incredulous laugh. Mr. Finch rolled his eyes, a theatrical display of annoyance at this childish interruption. Even Lena, shocked, reached for her daughter. "Zola, honey." "No." But Zola didn't move. Her gaze remained locked on Judge Albright, who had frozen, his gavel hovering in midair. He was a man of order, of rules. A child speaking in his court was a breach of every protocol, but there was something in her posture, in the sheer, unadulterated confidence of her stare, that gave him pause. "And who are you?" the judge asked, his voice low and dangerous. He expected her to say, "I'm her daughter," to burst into tears, to create a scene that he would then have to manage. He was wrong. Zola took a small breath, the way her father had taught her to before making a crucial point. "My name is Zola Hayes," she stated, her voice resonating with an authority that belied her size, "and I'm my mom's lawyer." A collective gasp rippled through the few spectators in the gallery. Abernathy's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of disbelief. This was better than he could have imagined. The woman was so desperate. She was letting her child make a mockery of the court. Finch stood up again. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The defendant is clearly turning this proceeding into a circus. We ask that you disregard this outburst and render your judgment." Judge Albright looked from the indignant lawyer to the tiny girl. The law was clear. A 9-year-old could not be a lawyer. She wasn't a member of the bar. She had no standing. He should, by all rights, have her removed. "Young lady," he said, his tone stern, trying to regain control of his courtroom, "you are not a lawyer. You cannot speak for the defendant. Please sit down, or I will have the bailiff escort you and your mother from the room." But Zola didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't sit down. Instead, she held up the leather-bound book. "I know I'm not a member of the bar, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a logic that was impossible to ignore. "But the law says my mother has the right to a fair defense. The law says evidence must be heard, and you haven't heard all the evidence." Her words hung in the air, a direct challenge not to his authority, but to the very principles he was sworn to uphold. She wasn't arguing with him. She was reminding him of his duty. This was no longer just about an eviction. It was about the integrity of the room itself. The judge lowered his gavel slowly back to the bench. The impatience in his eyes was being replaced by something else. A deep, profound curiosity. Who was this child? He looked at Lena, who seemed as stunned as everyone else. He looked at Abernathy, whose smug amusement was now tinged with a flicker of unease. And he looked back at Zola, at the old book she held so reverently. "What evidence?" he asked, the question itself a monumental breach of his own protocol. Finch started to object again, but the judge silenced him with a single, sharp glare. The floor, for the moment, belonged to a 9-year-old girl. Zola knew this was her only chance. She had to make him understand. She had to make them all understand. The room was silent. Wait. This was her opening statement, and she would not waste it. She would use the words her father had given her, the wisdom he had poured into the pages of the book she now held in her hands. Zola's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the swirling emotions in the room. She wasn't flustered by the attention. She seemed to draw strength from it. "This book,"
she began, her voice steady as she patted the worn leather cover. "Belonged to my father, David Hayes. He was a lawyer, not a rich one," she added, glancing pointedly at Mr. Finch, "but a good one. He believed the law was for everyone, not just the people who could afford to buy it." The judge's expression remained stony, but he was listening. Every word was being absorbed. "Before he died, he taught me things. He taught me that a contract is a promise, and a promise can't be changed by one person without the other person knowing. That's not a promise anymore. That's a lie." She wasn't using legal jargon. She was using the simple, unassailable language of right and wrong. A language that cut through the procedural fog Finch had so expertly created. Abernathy shifted in his seat, the twitch in his jaw more pronounced now. This was not going according to plan. "My father kept notes on all his cases in this journal," Zola continued, opening the book. The pages were filled with dense, elegant handwriting. He wrote about a case, Jennings versus Sterling Holdings. In that case, a big company tried to do the same thing. They added a fee to a contract after it was signed, and then pretended it was there all along. She was citing precedent. A 9-year-old girl was citing precedent from a personal journal. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on anyone, yet the logic of her argument was undeniable. She looked directly at Abernathy. "My father wrote here," she said, tracing a line of text with her small finger, "that liars always make the same mistake. They think the paper is the only thing that matters. But the truth leaves fingerprints everywhere." Mr. Finch could stay silent no longer. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. She's reading from a diary. This is not evidence. It is hearsay of the highest order. We don't even know if this David Hayes was a real lawyer." The insult was meant to shatter Zola's composure, to reduce her father's legacy to a fiction. But before Judge Albright could rule on the objection, a new voice, deep and resonant, echoed from the back of the courtroom. "Oh, he was real," the voice said, "and he was one of the finest legal minds I ever had the privilege of knowing." The courtroom door had opened so quietly that no one had noticed. Standing there was an elderly black man, tall and distinguished, with a mane of silver hair and an aura of immense authority. He wore a simple but impeccably tailored suit. His face was familiar, the kind of face you see in newspapers and history books. A wave of recognition and awe washed over the room. The court reporter gasped. The bailiff straightened his posture as if the president had just walked in. Judge Albright's jaw went slack. Even Mr. Abernathy, who prided himself on being unimpressed by anyone, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. The man was Justice Marcus Thorne, retired from the Supreme Court, a living legend, a man whose opinions had shaped the nation's laws for 4 decades, and he was standing in the back of courtroom 4B. On a Tuesday morning, his presence instantly changed the very gravity of the room. This was no longer a minor eviction case. It had become something else entirely. Justice Thorne walked slowly down the center aisle, his eyes fixed on Zola. He stopped beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He looked at the open journal in her hands, and a look of fond recognition softened his stern features. "David Hayes was my student, many years ago," Justice Thorne said, his voice filling the now sacred silence. "He was brilliant. He had a passion for justice I have rarely seen since, and that journal, he called it his conscience. He believed that a lawyer's true worth was measured not by his wins, but by the truth he was willing to fight for." He then turned his gaze upon Judge Albright, who looked as if he were a student again himself. "Your Honor," Justice Thorne said, his tone respectful but firm, "I believe this young lady has presented a compelling reason to examine the evidence more closely. Her father taught her well. The truth does, indeed, leave fingerprints." The catalyst had arrived. The scales of justice, so heavily tilted in Abernathy's favor just moments before, were about to swing dramatically in the other direction. Zola was no longer just a little girl with a book. She was the protégée of a legal giant, her credibility vouched for by one of the most respected figures in the country. The game had changed.
The arrival of Justice Marcus Thorne was like a thunderstorm breaking on a humid day. The oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom was shattered, replaced by a crackling, electric tension. Judge Albright, who moments before had been a figure of supreme authority, now looked almost flustered. His deference to the legendary retired justice palpable. He cleared his throat, his gaze shifting from Thorne to the suddenly very small-looking figures of Abernathy and his lawyer. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. "Justice Thorne," Judge Albright began, his voice a notch higher than usual, "this is an unexpected honor. Of course the court will consider any insights you may have." Mr. Finch, realizing his aggressive tactics were now a liability, quickly changed his tune. "Your Honor, we mean no disrespect to the court or to Justice Thorne. We are simply trying to adhere to established procedure." "Procedure, Mr. Finch," Justice Thorne said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel, "is the pathway to justice, not a wall to hide behind. And I believe young Miss Hayes is pointing us down the correct path." He turned his kind, intelligent eyes back to Zola. "Zola," he said. And the way he spoke her name was a validation in itself. "What was it your father used to say about digital documents?" Zola's face lit up. She flipped a few pages in her journal. "He said that paper can lie, but pixels have a memory. He said to always ask for the original file. The metadata never lies." She looked straight at Judge Albright. "Your Honor, I ask that the court examine the metadata of the electronic file for Exhibit A." It was a brilliant move, a masterful stroke of legal strategy delivered by a 9-year-old. She wasn't just accusing Abernathy of forging a document. She was telling the court exactly how to prove it. Mr. Finch paled. "Objection. The defendant, or her representative, is on a fishing expedition. This is an undue burden on my client." Abernathy was now visibly sweating. He shot a panicked look at Finch, a look that said, "Do something." But Finch's protest was weak, and he knew it. Judge Albright looked at Finch, then at Abernathy's increasingly guilty face, and finally at the unwavering certainty in Zola's eyes. A certainty now co-signed by Justice Thorne. The decision was simple. "Overruled, Mr. Finch," the judge said, his voice now firm with renewed purpose. He gestured to the court clerk. "Please have our IT specialist come to the courtroom and instruct the plaintiff to provide the original digital document file for Exhibit A immediately." Abernathy began to stammer. "I don't know if I have it with me. It's on my office computer." "Then your lawyer can call your office and have it emailed to the court instantly." Judge Albright snapped, his patience for Abernathy's games now completely gone. "The court will take a 15-minute recess." As the judge left the bench, the courtroom dissolved into a flurry of hushed whispers. Abernathy and Finch, huddled together, their panicked argument audible to those nearby. Lena, who had been a spectator to this whirlwind, finally found her voice. She knelt and pulled Zola into a fierce hug, tears of disbelief and hope streaming down her face. "Zola, how did you know?" she whispered. "Daddy told me," Zola said simply, clutching the journal. "He said to always follow the lie back to its source." Justice Thorne watched them with a gentle smile. He approached Lena. "Ma'am, your daughter is remarkable. David would be so incredibly proud." The 15 minutes were the longest of Abernathy's life. A court specialist, a young woman with an air of no-nonsense efficiency, set up a laptop connected to the large screens in the courtroom. A tense silence fell once more as Judge Albright retook the bench. "Mr. Finch, has the file been received?" The lawyer nodded, his face grim. "It has, Your Honor." "Then let's proceed," the judge commanded. The IT specialist typed a few commands, and the lease agreement, Exhibit A, appeared on the screens. It looked exactly as it had on paper. Abernathy allowed himself a sliver of hope. Maybe the girl was wrong. Maybe this would all blow over. Now the judge said to the specialist, "Please display the document's metadata, specifically the creation date and the date of the last modification." The specialist's fingers flew across the keyboard. A new window popped up, filled with lines of text and code. But 3 lines stood out. stark and damning. Creation date: October 14th, 2021. That was when Lena had signed the original lease. Last modified date: June 2nd, 2023. That was 3 days ago, just 1 day before the eviction notice was issued. The specialist highlighted the modification date. The file history shows that the content of the document was altered on this date, Your Honor. The majority of the text was unchanged, but a single paragraph was inserted on page 2. The room was utterly silent. The lie had been laid bare for all to see. The truth had left its fingerprints, well, just as David Hayes had said it would. The information on the screen hung in the air. A digital confession. The date and time of the modification were a silent, screaming indictment of Mr. Abernathy's character and his case. Every eye in the room was on him. The smug, confident Landis who had walked in that morning was gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate man, whose carefully constructed world had just been demolished by a 9-year-old girl and her father's ghost. His face, which had been pale, was now a blotchy, unhealthy red. A sheen of sweat covered his forehead. He stared at the screen as if he could will the numbers to change, but they were as fixed and unyielding as the truth itself. Mr. Finch, his high-priced suit, suddenly looking cheap and theatrical, slumped slightly. A good lawyer knows when the fight is lost, and this one was a massacre. He could offer no objections, no counter-arguments. There was no procedure to hide behind when the evidence was displayed on a 40-inch monitor for everyone, including the judge, to see. Judge Albright's face was a thundercloud. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by a cold, controlled fury. He had been lied to in his own courtroom. His time had been wasted, and the very integrity of his bench had been threatened by a petty, greedy fraud. He slowly turned his gaze from the screen to Mr. Abernathy, and the weight of that gaze seemed to physically crush the man. "Mr. Abernathy," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "do you have any explanation for this discrepancy?" Abernathy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to his lawyer for help, but Finch simply stared straight ahead, disassociating himself from his client's implosion. All the arrogance, all the condescension, had evaporated, leaving behind only the pathetic core of his deceit. "I postings pub. It must be a mistake." He finally managed to croak, the words sounding feeble and absurd. "A computer glitch, a clerical error, a clerical error." Judge Albright repeated, his voice dripping with ice. "A clerical error, that just happens to invent a clause that benefits you. A clerical error, that occurs the day before you file for an eviction based on that very clause. The court finds that highly improbable." He then looked at Zola, who was watching the scene unfold with a somber, steady gaze. She felt no glee, only a quiet sense of rightness, of an imbalance being corrected. Her father had taught her that justice wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Judge Albright turned his attention back to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Finch, given this new and irrefutable evidence, do you wish to reconsider your client's position?" Finch stood slowly. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, the plaintiff wishes to withdraw the complaint." "Withdrawal is not sufficient," the judge boomed, his voice now thundering through the room. "The complaint is dismissed, with prejudice. This means it can never be filed again." He banged the gavel once, a sharp, definitive crack that echoed the breaking of Abernathy's scheme. "Furthermore," he continued, his eyes still locked on the crumbling landlord, "this court has witnessed a clear and deliberate attempt to commit fraud and perjury. Presenting a falsified document as evidence is a serious crime." He pointed a finger at Abernathy. "I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation and potential criminal charges. Mr. Abernathy, you are not to leave the courthouse. The bailiff will escort you to a holding room to await questioning." The bailiff, who had been watching with rapt attention, now moved with purpose, his expression grim. He stood beside Abernathy, whose face had turned a pasty white. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. This wasn't just about a lost eviction case anymore. He was facing jail time. His reputation was destroyed. His world had been upended. And it was all because he had underestimated the quiet woman and the little girl he had tried to bully. He had seen them as nothing, a minor obstacle. He failed to see the strength in Lena's love for her daughter, and he failed to comprehend the power of the legacy Zola carried in her father's journal. As the bailiff led the stunned and defeated Abernathy away, his expensive shoes scuffing on the floor, a quiet sense of order returned to the room. Justice had been served. Swift and absolute. Lena was openly weeping now, but her tears were not of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming relief, of gratitude, of profound pride in her daughter. She wrapped Zola in her arms, burying her face in her daughter's hair, her body shaking with the release of weeks of pent-up terror. Zola, small but strong, held her mother tightly. Over her mother's shoulder, she saw Justice Thorne, who gave her a slow, solemn nod. It was a nod that said, "Well done. The work is complete. The battle was over." The lie had been silenced, and the truth, in the clear, unwavering voice of a child, had roared. The transition from the charged atmosphere of the courtroom to the quiet hum of the hallway was jarring. For Lena and Zola, it was like stepping from a storm into the calm that follows. The heavy weight that had been pressing Lena's chest for weeks had finally lifted, leaving her feeling light-headed and weak with relief. She leaned against the wall, holding Zola's hand as if it were an anchor, her other hand clutching the original, untampered lease like a sacred text. People filing out of the courtroom glanced at them with a mixture of curiosity and awe. They had all witnessed the same unbelievable event, a child who, through sheer force of will and intellect, had brought a powerful man to his knees. Soon Justice Thorne emerged, his presence commanding the same respect in the hallway as it had in the court. He bypassed the reporters, who were already starting to gather, their instincts telling them a major story had just broken, and walked directly to Lena and Zola. He knelt, so he could look Zola in the eye. "David Hayes was a brilliant man," he said, his voice soft and filled with genuine emotion. "But I believe today, his daughter surpassed him. He didn't just teach you about the law, Zola. He taught you about courage. That is a far more valuable lesson." Zola simply nodded, accepting the praise with the same quiet dignity she had displayed all morning. "He always said courage was just being scared of something but doing the right thing anyway," she replied. A slow smile spread across Justice Thorne's face. He was right about that too. He then looked at Lena, his expression one of profound respect. "You have a remarkable daughter, Miss Hayes. Her potential is limitless. If you'll allow it, I would like to help. I have some friends at the university who run a program for gifted young minds, and I think it's time someone established a scholarship in David Hayes's name to help students who share his passion for justice." Lena was speechless. An offer of mentorship from a legal legend, a path forward for her daughter that she could never have dreamed of. It was too much to comprehend. Tears welled in her eyes again. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Across the hall, they saw Mr. Abernathy being led by the bailiff into a small windowless room. The door closed behind him, with a quiet final click. His face was a mask of utter despair. The man who had thrived on humiliating others was now facing his own public disgrace. His arrogance had been a brittle shield, shattered by the simple, unadorned truth. The juxtaposition was stark and deeply satisfying. It was the perfect, cathartic end to a nightmare. As they prepared to leave, Judge Albright approached them. His stern judicial mask was gone, replaced by a look of genuine humility. He looked at Zola. "In 25 years on the bench," he said, "I have never seen anything like what you did today. You reminded me of something I think many of us forget over time, that justice is not about procedure or precedent. It's about people. It's about truth. You have my deepest respect, young lady, and my apologies for underestimating you." He reached out and shook her small hand, a gesture of profound significance. He wasn't shaking the hand of a child. He was shaking the hand of a peer, an equal in the pursuit of justice. Lena watched this exchange, her heart swelling with a pride so immense, it felt like it might burst. Her daughter hadn't just saved their home, she had commanded the respect of the most powerful men in the room. She had honored her father's memory in the most profound way possible. They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. The world seemed different, more vibrant. The air felt cleaner. Lena squeezed Zola's hand, a silent communication of love and gratitude that needed no words. Zola looked up at her mother, a small triumphant smile finally gracing her lips. She had faced the lion in his den and had not been devoured. She had carried her father's shield, and it had protected them all. Their future, which had seemed so bleak just hours before, now stretched out before them, bright with promise. The story of what happened in Courtroom 4B did not stay within those four walls. It spread like wildfire. It started with the whispers of the spectators, then the frantic calls of the court reporters. By evening, it was the lead story on the local news. 9-year-old lawyer exposes fraud in courtroom shocker. The headline read. The news segment showed a brief grainy cell phone video someone had taken of Zola standing on the bench, her voice clear and strong. It showed a flustered Mr. Abernathy being led away, and it featured an interview with a beaming Justice Marcus Thorne, who spoke eloquently about his former student, David Hayes, and the incredible legacy he had left behind in his daughter. The story went viral. It was shared millions of times on social media. People were captivated by the narrative. The underdog single mother, the greedy landlord, and the brilliant, courageous child who brought him down. Zola became an overnight symbol of hope. Zola's law became a trending topic. People were inspired by her quiet strength, by her simple, powerful belief that right should triumph over might. Donations poured into a fund Lena set up, not for themselves, but to support the Legal Aid Society that had been too overwhelmed to help them. Justice Thorne was true to his word. The David Hayes Memorial Scholarship for Ethical Advocacy was established at the local university's law school, ensuring that future generations of lawyers would be inspired by a man who valued conscience over cash. Zola was enrolled in the university's program for gifted youth, where her incredible intellect was challenged and nurtured. She devoured books on logic, ethics, and history, all while remaining the same humble, thoughtful girl she had always been. Mr. Abernathy's downfall was as swift as it was complete. Faced with irrefutable evidence, he was charged with perjury, forgery, and witness tampering. His other tenants, empowered by Zola's victory, came forward with their own stories of harassment and fraudulent fees. A class action lawsuit was filed. His real estate empire, built on bullying and deceit, crumbled into dust. He lost everything: his properties, his reputation, and his freedom. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how arrogance and greed can lead to ruin. Lena and Zola stayed in their small apartment. They hung the colorful wind chimes back up on their balcony, and their gentle musical sound was no longer a source of anxiety, but a symbol of their victory. It was a reminder that they had fought for their home, and won. Their lives were forever changed, not by money or fame, but by the quiet courage they had found within themselves. The leather-bound journal, Zola's inheritance, sat on a special shelf in the living room. It was more than just a book of legal notes now. It was a testament to a father's love, a guide to living a life of integrity, and a source of unshakable strength. It was proof that one person's belief in justice, passed down to his child, could be a force powerful enough to change the world, even if it was just one small corner of it at a time. The echoes of that day in court continued to resonate, a story told and retold, inspiring countless people to stand up for what they believe in, to question injustice, and to never ever underestimate the power of a small voice speaking a great truth. Justice, they all learned, doesn't always come from a thundering gavel or a powerful lawyer. Sometimes, It comes in the form of a 9-year-old girl standing on a bench, holding a book, and speaking for the voiceless. So what can we take away from the incredible story of Zola and Lena Hayes? It's more than just a satisfying tale of an underdog's triumph. It's a profound lesson in where true power really comes from. We live in a world that often tells us that power lies in wealth, in status, in having the loudest voice, or the most aggressive lawyer. We are taught to be intimidated by authority, to accept that policy is policy, even when that policy feels fundamentally wrong. Mr. Abernathy believed in this version of power. He wielded his position and his resources like a weapon, confident that they made him untouchable. He saw Lena as weak and Zola as insignificant, and that was his greatest mistake. He, like so many others who abuse their power, failed to understand that there is a deeper, more resilient strength. It's the strength of integrity. It's the power of the truth. It's the courage that comes from fighting for something more than just yourself. For family, for dignity, for what is right. Zola Hayes didn't have a law degree. She didn't have money. She didn't have status. What she had was far more potent. She had the wisdom passed down from her father, a man who understood that the law was meant to be a shield for people like her mother, not a sword for men like Abernathy. She had the clarity to see through the lies and the courage to call them out. Her power wasn't external. It was internal. It was forged in love, loss, and an unshakable moral compass. This story serves as a vital reminder for every single one of us. How many times have we been in a situation where we felt powerless, faced with an unfair rule, a dismissive boss, a system that seems rigged against us? How many times have we stayed silent because we believed our voice was too small to make a difference? Zola teaches us that no voice is too small when it speaks the truth. She reminds us that knowledge, integrity, and courage are the great equalizers. Abernathy's entire fortress of lies was brought down not by an army, but by a single well-placed question, a single piece of evidence that he thought no one would ever be smart enough or brave enough to look for. Think about the Abernathys in your own life or in the world around you. They thrive on the assumption that you will be too scared, too tired, or too intimidated to challenge them. They count on your silence. Your greatest power against them is to refuse to be silent. It's to educate yourself, to know your rights, to hold on to your principles, and to have the courage to speak up, even if your voice shakes. The next time you feel underestimated, the next time someone tries to make you feel small or insignificant, remember Zola standing on that courtroom bench. Remember that your character is your strength, your integrity is your shield, and the truth, when you have the courage to wield it, is the most powerful weapon of all. The question is not whether you will face injustice. The question is, what will you do when you do?